and welcome to social psychology. I will be your professor for this course. My name is Dr. Shane Sharp, a professor of sociology here, and we will begin by going over an introduction to social psychology. Now, you've all signed up for this class to learn about social psychology, but what exactly is social psychology? Put it another way, what are you hopefully going to learn about in this course? Well, let's start by defining what we mean by social psychology. A good general definition of social psychology is this: the scientific study of the nature and causes of individual behavior, thoughts, and emotions caused by the real and imagined presence of others. To learn about what social psychology is really about, let's look at the specific components of this definition in detail. Part of the definition I want to talk about is scientific study. What do I mean by that? Well, what I mean by that is social psychology is a science. But what is science? Well, science is a system of accumulated knowledge claims based on carefully collected empirical observations. Empirical means information collected through one's senses, such as sounds, sights, taste, touches, and smells. All sciences are based on sensory observations of the real world, whether it's physicists observing falling bodies in a laboratory, biologists observing new species in the rainforest, anthropologists observing and documenting exotic cultures, or social psychologists observing how the real and imagined presence of others influences how people behave, think, and feel. The collection of observations scientists collect through their senses that they use to make knowledge claims is called data. Always remember, if a claim doesn't have any empirical data to support it, it is not a scientific claim, no matter how scientific it sounds, or if someone with scientific expertise makes the claim without supporting data. It is important for you to understand that social psychology, like the disciplines of psychology and sociology in general, is a science. All the legitimate knowledge claims made in social psychology are supported by data. If there is no data to support a knowledge claim about the presence of others and how it influences people's thoughts, behaviors, and feelings, it cannot claim to be a social psychological claim. Science, of course, isn't the only type of knowledge claims. People in everyday life make knowledge claims about the world, especially the social world. However, you should be aware that these claims are not scientific claims because they are not supported by data. The first type of knowledge claims that aren't scientific are common sense knowledge claims, or the things that everyone knows, so to speak. Common sense is a very powerful tool for getting around in day-to-day life. However, one of the main problems with a lot of common sense is that many of the assumptions that we have regarding common sense, or what you're reading for this lecture calls folk wisdom, are not supported by empirical observations or data. For example, there's the common sense assumption that familiarity breeds contempt. However, there's no real data to support this claim. Rather, the opposite seems to be true. The more two people interact and get to know each other, the more they begin to like each other. Or consider the common sense assumption, misery loves company. Again, there isn't much evidence for this assumption. In fact, one thing that causes and is a symptom of depression is social isolation and withdrawing from others. Another problem with common sense is that it's often contradictory. That is, common sense often includes many assumptions that cancel each other out, so to speak. A great example of this is the contradiction between the common sense assumptions birds of a feather flock together and opposites attract in regards to the formation of friendships and romantic relationships. Both of these assumptions can't be correct at the same time, yet people keep both of them in their back pockets, so to speak, when they need to explain a friendship formation here and a romantic relationship formation there. One of these statements can have more empirical support than the other, but unless this evidence is cited, neither of these statements is a scientific claim. Overall, you've got to be careful with common sense. And this is especially the case when trying to explain why people do what they do. Many people think that it is very easy to explain people's behavior, that it's just common sense. But explaining why people do what they do is a lot harder than people think. Thinking that it's easy to explain people's behavior gets people into a lot of trouble, a lot of the time. If you want a recent example, there's this. Many government officials thought it was common sense that once a safe vaccine for COVID-19 was developed, everyone would, of course, get it. But of course, they didn't, which led to the lengthening of the pandemic. Another thing that isn't science are knowledge claims that appeal to authority, which are statements that basically state, this is true because X said it's true. You've probably run into this in your lives at some point when somebody tried to argue with you that something was true because the Bible or the Quran or the Queen of England or your parent or Albert Einstein said it was true. While authorities on particular subject matters may make knowledge claims that are more or less true, their authority itself doesn't make these knowledge claims scientific. I don't care who is making the knowledge claim. If it doesn't have empirical observations to support it, then it is not a scientific claim. If science relied heavily on authority to evaluate the truth of knowledge claims, scientific progress would probably be very slow and limited because current scientists wouldn't want to go against the knowledge claims of past eminent scientists. However, science often progresses when current scientists tell the eminent scientists of the past that they were wrong. Current scientists often collect new empirical observations that do not line up with the knowledge claims of previous scientists. And because scientific knowledge claims are always based on empirical observations, this leads to current scientists telling the scientists of the past that their claims were incomplete, misguided, or just plain wrong. Unfortunately, in everyday life, we often see people with extensive scientific training and backgrounds using their authority rather than empirical evidence to support their knowledge claims. There are plenty of people with medical degrees and doctorate degrees, people who aren't Mr. or Mrs. but Doctor, who use their scientific authority rather than empirical evidence to shill various snake oils. A prime example of this is Dr. Oz, Oprah's used to be favorite medical professional. Dr. Oz does have a medical degree and is a world-renowned surgeon in New York City, but he uses his authority as a surgeon to shill a bunch of health products in which there's no empirical evidence that they work. His claims come off as scientific, though, since he does have an advanced medical degree. But again, these claims aren't scientific because there is no empirical evidence for them. In short, don't be fooled by fancy degrees and titles when it comes to scientific claims. If a person can't give you empirical evidence that supports a claim, then it is by no means scientific. Another thing that isn't science is value statements, like football is the best sport ever, or democracy is the best form of government. Science is not in the business of telling people what they should and should not value because such claims can't really be supported with empirical observations. Science can't tell you that football is actually the best sport because there isn't a way to empirically evaluate if one sport is quote unquote better than another. This is because what makes a sport best for me can vary quite a bit from what makes a sport best for you. I may think football is the best sport because it is, in my view, the most strategic of sports. But you may think that ice hockey is the best sport because it is the most fast-paced and frantic sport. However, what science can do is tell people what the consequences of holding particular values can be. Science can evaluate what might happen if most of the people in a society believe football is the best sport, or what might happen if a person believes that democracy is the best form of government. Another thing that isn't science are belief statements that cannot be supported with empirical evidence, like God does or doesn't exist, or that there is or isn't life after death. These statements may be true, but no valid evidence acquired through our senses can support them. No one can provide you with any legitimate empirical evidence that God does exist, nor can they provide you with any legitimate evidence that God doesn't exist. Now, all sciences, from physics to biology to economics to social psychology, have three main goals. The first of these goals is description. Description is the first step in creating scientific knowledge. To understand whatever we want to understand, we first must describe it accurately and adequately. In order to produce accurate descriptions of the objects under investigation, scientists develop and use specialized sets of concepts. Every science has its own set of concepts, and as you'll learn, social psychology is no exception. Concepts are abstract ideas communicated by words that refer to common properties of an object or thing. A good example of a concept is mass. This term refers to the amount of space an object takes up. It is an abstraction because I can use this term to refer to the amount of space any and all objects take up, whether it's a basketball or another person, an automobile, or a neutron star. In social psychology, some of the concepts that you'll learn about are self, attributions, and cognitive dissonance. And there are three rules for creating and using concepts. First, you should use only one word for one concept. That is, don't have a term that refers to two or more concepts, or don't use two terms to refer to the same concept. This is quite different from everyday language, where one word can mean a variety of things. A good example of this in social psychology is the concept of attitude. The term attitude can be used in different ways in everyday life. It can refer to a ballet move. It could denote someone who is angry and uncooperative, like you've got an attitude. It can denote someone who has confidence. So, she sashayed into the room with attitude. But in social psychology, attitude means one thing and only one thing. This is why it's very important to define concepts, and you'll be learning the definitions of various social psychological concepts throughout the semester. A second rule for using concepts is that they have to be measurable, or there has to be some ways or means by which we can, quote unquote, see the concepts and variations of it in the world. Scientists develop detailed and precise procedures for measuring concepts. Developing good measures of concepts is especially important in social psychology because many of the concepts social psychologists are interested in cannot be directly observed. For instance, I can't look directly at you and see your self-esteem. This is something that exists in your mind as a set of thoughts and emotions. And because I am unable to read minds like Professor X, I've got to come up with a way to measure your self-esteem that will somehow turn these thoughts and emotions in your head into something that I can actually see or hear, like your written or verbal responses to a set of questions. And a third rule for creating and using concepts is that concepts have to be useful. If a concept no longer helps scientists describe what they are studying accurately, completely, or in detail, they get rid of it and create new ones. Science often progresses when it gets rid of old concepts and replaces them with concepts that more accurately and completely explain what scientists want to describe. The second goal of science is explanation. Once scientists believe that they have adequately and accurately described something, they try to explain why this something exists and how this something came about. For example, consider any particular attitude, say one's attitudes toward homosexuality. Describing this adequately and accurately shows that there is quite a bit of variation in these attitudes. Some people have a positive attitude toward homosexuality, some have a attitude, and some don't seem to care one way or the other. As a social psychologist, I might be interested in explaining one, why these variations exist, and two, how these variations come about. Explanations in science often take the form of causal arguments. A causal argument is an argument that makes the claim that changes in one thing are the reason for changes in another thing. Going back to the attitudes towards homosexuality example, if I wanted to explain variations in attitudes toward homosexuality, I would want to figure out what factors cause some people to have positive attitudes, factors that cause some people to have negative attitudes, and factors that cause some people to have neutral attitudes toward homosexuality, and why these particular factors lead to these variations. For instance, I might evaluate whether believing the Bible is the Word of God is a cause of these variations, and if so, why this would be the case, i.e., because the various verses in the Bible that seem to prohibit homosexual behavior. Now, we make causal arguments all the time in our everyday lives. When you use the word because, you are making some form of causal argument. Like when you say that your best friend broke up with her girlfriend because the girlfriend was crazy, or when you tell yourself you did poorly on a college paper because the professor didn't give good instructions. In this regard, we are all what one social psychologist called naive scientists. However, the causal arguments we all make in everyday life are often quite biased, unsystematic, and sometimes based on poor logic. The causal arguments scientists make need to be strong and logical, and this translates to needing to establish four things. First, to make a causal argument, a scientist first has to establish that there actually exists an association between a supposed cause and a supposed effect. In particular, scientists must show that when there is a change in the supposed causal factor, there is also a change in the supposed effect. This is absolutely mandatory and the first thing that scientists must do when making causal arguments. If there is no association between two factors, there could be no causal relationship between the two factors, and thus no need to go any further with a causal argument. For instance, let's say I'm trying to explain variations in attitudes towards homosexuality. And let's say I believe that level of education is a cause of this variation. The first thing I would need to do is to establish that variations in education level are actually associated with attitudes towards homosexuality. When education levels change, so too in general does attitudes toward homosexuality. If there isn't any association like this, I can't go on with my causal argument. If there is, I can. Second thing that needs to be established to make a causal argument in science is correct causal direction. To make any causal argument, a scientist must first show that changes in the supposed cause come before the supposed effect. Sometimes it may be the case that the supposed cause is actually the effect. For instance, let's say I'm trying to make the causal argument that belief in the Bible as the Word of God causes variations in attitudes towards homosexuality. This makes sense, but the causal direction legitimately and logically could be the other way around. For instance, people's attitudes towards homosexuality could have an effect on their beliefs about the Bible. People first form their negative attitudes towards homosexuality and then begin to view the Bible as the Word of God because it basically tells them what they want to hear. Or people first form their positive attitudes towards homosexuality and then begin to see the Bible as an imperfect piece of moral guidelines written by humans thousands of years ago. The third thing that needs to be established to make a causal argument in science is that there is no spuriousness. Spuriousness occurs when another factor explains the supposed causal relationship between two factors. For example, let's say I find an association between political party membership and attitudes towards homosexuality. This might be a spurious relationship, though, since both of these things can be influenced by another variable out there: religion. Religion influences what political parties people belong to and their attitudes towards homosexuality. And when I take religion into account, the association between political party and attitudes towards homosexuality may disappear. The need to establish correct direction and establish a lack of spuriousness is the reason for the famous phrase, correlation does not necessarily mean causation. Correlation here is just a numerical indicator of strength and the direction of an association. Just because two things are associated with one another doesn't mean one causes the other. There are all types of graphs you can find on the internet that show a correlation between things that one would be silly to think are causal. My particular favorite is the one that shows that as the number of pirates in the world has increased, so too has average global temperatures. That means that pirates cause climate change, right? Of course not. And the fourth thing that needs to be established to make a causal argument in science is that there is a plausible mechanism. A mechanism is an explanation for how one thing causes another thing. For instance, if I were able to show an association between belief in the Bible and attitudes toward homosexuality, establish that beliefs in the Bible come before attitudes towards homosexuality, and provide evidence that the relationship isn't spurious, then I would want to offer some sort of explanation for why beliefs about the Bible would cause variations in homosexual attitudes. Say, because the Bible contains several verses and passages and stories that seem to condemn homosexual behavior. And the third goal of science is prediction. Science uses data and knowledge claims to make informed predictions about future events. This is valuable because knowing with some certainty what will happen if X occurs helps people determine what actions to take. For example, if I know that a set of particular characteristics can make persuasive messages more effective, I can use that knowledge to create more successful persuasive messages. But of course, reality is a messy thing. It is very hard to make perfect predictions in every science. And this is especially the case for the social sciences, since human beings are complicated creatures with big brains that are motivated to do what they do for a variety of reasons. Because of this, the predictions scientists make are often probabilistic in nature. That is, they are predictions that state the odds or chances of whether an event will or won't happen in the future. Like saying there is a 75% chance Joe Biden will win the next presidential election. People sometimes criticize science for making so called incorrect predictions, but probabilistic predictions can't really be incorrect, just surprising or unexpected. If I predict that Donald Trump has just 10% chance to win the 2024 presidential election and Trump does win this election, my prediction wasn't necessarily wrong. Rather, it was just an unlikely but not impossible outcome. Making predictions also helps protect against what's called hindsight bias, which is the tendency to perceive past events as more predictable than they actually were. Once something happens, many people say, well, I could see that coming, even though they didn't. A relatively recent example of this was the election of Donald Trump to the presidency in 2016. After he won, many people claimed that they quote unquote saw it coming, even though that really wasn't the case, quite frankly. When one has to make predictions, though, this keeps one honest, so to speak. Of science ultimately lead to the development of theory, which is a set of interrelated concepts and propositions that explains a set of observations. Theory is made up of concepts that help us understand and talk about a set of observations, explain the causal relationships between the concepts, and help make predictions about the causal relationships between the concepts in the future. So, unlike what you might hear in everyday talk, theory is not the same as speculation. It is a set of interrelated concepts and propositions that help people understand, explain, and predict a set of observations. For example, consider the theory of natural selection in the field of biology. There are a set of observations, such as fossil records, natural field studies, or laboratory studies, that show that biological organisms evolve or change over time. Charles Darwin proposed the theory of natural selection, which argues that organisms evolved in order to adapt to ever-changing environments to make sense of all these observations. Moving back to the definition, the second part of the definition I want to highlight is nature and causes of individual behavior, thoughts, and emotions. Psychology describes, explains, and predicts what people do, what people think, and what people feel. Why do people act in certain ways around authority figures? Why are people physically attracted to particular physical characteristics of others? What causes people to feel angry? These and other questions are what psychology tries to answer, and the answers they give are based on empirical observations of what people do, what they think, and what they feel. And again, going back to the definition, the third and last part of it that I want to highlight is the real and imagined presence of others. There are many things that influence people's behavior, their thoughts, and their emotions. However, social psychologists are interested in how people's behavior, thoughts, and emotions are influenced by the presence of others. This is what puts the social in social psychology. These others can be physical people in one's immediate presence, like during a face to face interaction with one's mother or one's boss. It can also be physical people that are in one's presence in a mediated fashion, as when a person calls her mother over FaceTime or a telephone call, or listening to a lecture from your social psychology professor on YouTube. The presence of physical others greatly influences people's behavior, thoughts, and feelings. For instance, I am influenced in some way your behavior right now, since you probably wouldn't be behaving in the way that you are right now if you weren't in my mediated presence. These others can also be others that exist in one's mind. This includes deities such as God or Allah, ancestors, a dead grandma one still talks to, and physical people not in one's immediate presence, such as one's very much still alive mother. These types of others, which you might call imagined others, do influence people's behavior, thoughts, and emotions. I probably don't have to tell you that deities have influenced many people's behavior throughout history and today. And if you've ever asked yourself, what would Mama think if I did X when Mama wasn't around, you were being influenced by her even though she wasn't in your physical presence. She was just in your mind. Now, there are four general ways in which the real or imagined others influence people's behavior, thoughts, and emotions. The first is the influence of a single real or imagined other on another person's behavior, thoughts, and emotions. A good example of this is persuasion attempts, or attempts where one person tries to get another person to behave, think, or feel in a particular way. We'll talk much more about this later in the semester. The second way the real and imagined presence of others influences people's behavior, thoughts, and feelings is when a real or imagined group affects a single individual's behavior, thoughts, and emotions. A good example of this is conformity, which is when people feel the need to mimic how a group is behaving, thinking, or feeling. And of course, we'll talk about this later in the semester. A third way is how the real or imagined individual influences a group's behavior, thoughts, and emotions. A good example of this is leadership, which is when one person guides and determines the goals of a group of people. And again, we will talk about leadership later on in this course. And the fourth and final way that the real and imagined presence of others influences people's behavior, thoughts, and feelings is the impact groups have on each other's behavior, thoughts, and emotions. A good example of this is intergroup conflict, which occurs when groups are antagonistic towards each other and fight one another. And you guessed it, we'll be talking about this later in the course. Now, while all social psychologists are interested in how the real or imagined presence of others influences people's behavior, thinking, and emotional experiences, social psychologists do differ in their approaches to the topic. Some approach social psychology from what I call a cognitive perspective. This is the primary way that social psychologists working in the psychology departments on college and university campuses, including here at NIU, approach social psychology. The cognitive approach to social psychology focuses on two things. First, it focuses on how cognitive processes and the behavior these cognitive processes generate are influenced by the real and imagined presence of others. For example, how does a person who is one's social superior influence his thinking and his emotional experiences? And what behaviors do these thoughts and emotions generate? The second thing the cognitive approach to social psychology focuses on is how cognitive processes influence how people view and interpret other people and their behavior. In other words, how do basic cognitive processes and all the biases that come with them influence how one forms their beliefs about other people and the reasons for other people's behavior and their emotional expressions and their thinking. How people view other people and how they explain their behavior helps explain much of people's behavior towards other people. But unfortunately, how humans create these impressions of others and their behavior is not as straightforward and accurate as one might hope or think. To think about this approach to social psychology in more concrete terms, ask yourself this. Have you ever liked some movie, TV show, music artist, video game, or whatever very, very much, but someone you were close to didn't? What did you tend to do in this situation? Did you try really hard to convince this person that they should like this thing that you really liked? Ask yourself, why did you do this? Why does it matter to you that someone close to you likes the same things you really like? You're not going to profit one way or another if someone close to you likes or doesn't like the things you like. So why? Well, there is a reason we do this, and I'll talk about this later on in the course. Or think about this. When people form impressions of other people, are they more likely to use information about this person they received first? Or are they more likely to use information they have most recently received? In other words, do first impressions really matter all that much? Or does what people do in the here and now matter more? And you'll learn the answer to this question later on in the course. The next approach to social psychology is the interpretive approach. This approach focuses on how people's interpretations of objects, especially real and imagined others, influence how they behave, think, and feel about these objects. No object, whether it's another person, an idea, or a physical object such as a table, has an inherent meaning that can guide people's behavior towards it. Rather, people interpret all things in reality, social and otherwise, and use these interpretations to determine how they're going to act toward these objects. So, if one wants to understand how people behave and feel towards particular objects, the interpretive approach argues that one has to find out what people's interpretations of particular objects are. Moreover, it is differences in interpretations of particular objects that lead to differences in how people behave toward and feel about these particular objects. Let me give an example. Donald Trump is an actual human being who exists in the real world. Now, we know from just a short glance that people act and feel very differently about Donald Trump. Why? It is because people have different interpretations of this single person. Some see him as a great man and a political leader. Some see him as the scum of the earth. Now, these interpretations are very context dependent. That is, people will often interpret and thus act differently toward the same object when the situation is different. I'll use a silly but accurate example. For a professional wrestler, a folding table in a wrestling ring is an implement of destruction, and he would use it as such. However, for this same professional wrestler, a folding table in a fellowship hall or of a church or a banquet hall would be a place just to set food and plates and silverware, and he would treat it as such. Same exact object, but different interpretations and behaviors toward this object based on the differing contexts. The interpretations people have of objects are often acquired during social interactions with other people. For instance, many people come to their interpretations of objects like Donald Trump or Jesus Christ or the concept of democracy from interactions with others during their lifetimes. Thus, the interpretive approach to social psychology also focuses a great deal on studying social interactions and how they lead people to have particular interpretations of particular objects. Another approach to the study of social psychology is the social structural approach. This approach focuses on two things. First, it focuses on how people's inhabiting the particular categories of ranked social attributes influence their behavior, thoughts, and emotions. In many modern contemporary societies, there are certain attributes such as one's gender, one's race, one's occupation, one's education level, one's age, that greatly influence the course of people's lives and how they're living their lives in the here and now. They do so because these attributes often consist of several categories that are ranked in terms of status and prestige, with some categories having more status and prestige than others. For example, in the United States, racial categories are ranked according to status and prestige, with whites having the most status and prestige and all other races having less. Another example, men tend to have more status and prestige than women in American society. Yet another example, certain occupations, such as physicians, attorneys, and professors, have more status and prestige than other occupations, such as garbage collectors and custodians. And please be aware that what I'm saying right now are just descriptive statements. They are not moral or judgmental statements. It is just a description of the way things are. The social structural approach to social psychology argues that the various social categories people inhabit greatly influence their behavior, thoughts, and emotions. For instance, many social psychologists find people's social categories greatly influence their experiences of mental illness. Also, social psychologists find people's social categories greatly influence how often they experience negative emotions such as anger, fear, and sadness. The second thing the social structural approach to social psychology focuses on is how people finding themselves in particular social arrangements and physical locations influence their behavior, thoughts, and emotions. People find themselves in particular family arrangements, particular small groups, neighborhoods, and formal organizations. Now, sometimes these arrangements were their choice, other times it's just luck and happenstance. Whatever the case, social psychologists who approach the topic from a social structural point of view argue that these arrangements can have a big effect on people's behavior, thoughts, and emotions. For instance, the family arrangements one finds oneself in as a child have a tremendous influence on people's behavior, thoughts, and emotions when they become adults. The prime finding here is that people who grow up in a two-parent household have more positive behavioral and emotional outcomes as adults than people who grow up in single-parent households. The fourth and final approach to social psychology is the evolutionary approach. This approach argues that people's behavior, thoughts, and feelings are greatly influenced by psychological mechanisms that evolve throughout humans' evolutionary history. Psychological mechanisms are specific ways of behaving, thinking, and feeling that gave early humans a survival and reproductive advantage. According to the theory of natural selection, traits and characteristics that give an organism an advantage in survival and reproduction are more likely to be passed down on to the next generation. In the same way, the evolutionary approach to social psychology argues that particular psychological mechanisms gave some humans a survival and reproductive advantage, and because of this, humans today are still influenced by these psychological mechanisms that arose thousands of years ago. For example, consider the taste for sweet and fatty foods that humans tend to have. Since foods was quite scarce on the plains of the African savanna where humans first arose, having a taste for sweet and fatty foods would have given humans an advantage over other humans who did not have a taste for sweet and fatty foods, since these types of foods tend to have more calories and their consumption lessens the risk of starvation. Because a quote-unquote sweet tooth gave early gave some early humans a survival and reproductive advantage, most humans today enjoy the taste of sweet fatty foods. We have inherited it from our biological ancestors. However, because these psychological mechanisms arose over 130,000 years ago when Homo sapiens first arose, these mechanisms can lead to behaviors, thoughts, and emotions that serve no adaptive purpose or are actually maladaptive in today's environment. This is because human cultural and technological evolution occurs much more quickly than human biological evolution. Biologically, humans are pretty much the same as they were 100,000 years ago. Culturally and technologically, though, that's not the case. This is why one evolutionary theorist called human beings Stone Agers in the fast lane. For example, consider the sweet tooth that humans have today that I just discussed. While this was very helpful to have in the early ancestral environment, because of the vast cultural and technological changes that have happened since then, this sweet and fatty foods abound now. Now, the sweet tooth actually leads to detrimental outcomes like obesity, heart disease, type 2 diabetes. Okay, so that's it for this lecture. Next lecture, we will discuss the methods used in social psychology. Goodbye.